Okay, so one of the ways that you might be tested on the topic of break-even is that you might be asked to produce a graph. Now, there is no set template for this. I find that this small table is a really quick and straightforward method in order to help you find the information that you need to draw the graph. Now you'll notice that this table is very condensed. I always have an output of 0, and the next and final output is determined by what it says in the question. So the question will usually give you a standard output. I've forgotten to write how many the normal output is, so I've chosen to do 1,000. So you'll get information. There'll always be some information on the variable costs, or it might call it direct costs, remember, and it'll give you amount for each product. It'll always give you the selling price, and it should always tell you the fixed costs for the business, or remember they might be called the indirect costs, just to test, do you know how those words interact? So I've drawn this up in quite a grid format. Yours doesn't have to look as good as that in the exam, because this point is just a working part rather than actually getting any marks. So the information that we need, first of all, I'm going to start with fixed costs. So it clearly says in the question, the fixed costs are £5,000 each month. So that's nice and easy. Fixed costs do not relate to how many you produce. So if you produce 0, it's still 5,000. And if you produce 1,000 soft toys, it's still 5,000. Remember, fixed costs are the ones that need to be paid whether or not your business is open. So whether or not any production is happening. So variable costs then, I'm a firm believer in making it as easy as possible. And so I'm going to write clearly that it says in the question, variable costs are £10, and I'm going to put that at the top of my variable column, just to give me some an easy directive. So it's a nice multiplication, variable costs, so it's 0 times 10. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that that's 10. And then it's 10 times 1,000. There's no shame in using your calculator. It's not an arithmetic test. I'd rather you got the number correct, but at least this way you're showing the examiner that you know the technique, and so you might get some own figure responses. Now, just because I like to show these things to the examiner, I'm going to remind the examiner that total costs is fixed costs and variable costs. So I'm adding across the two rows. Nice and easy. I've chosen good numbers so that we don't have to tax our brains too much. Now, if you like, you can almost put a hand over those three columns, fixed cost, variable cost and total cost, because while they're interconnected, the sales revenue has nothing to do. So I'm not going to use any of that information to help me here. Just because I like to show the examiners I know what I'm doing, I'm going to write that the selling price of one soft toy is £20. So again, it's the same sort of multiplication that I did for variable costs. £20 times by 0 is 0, and 20 times by 1,000 is 20,000. Now, I could stop there if I wanted. That would be perfectly acceptable. I don't have to do the profit or loss line in order to complete this activity, but you know I'm going to do it just for good practice. So I'm going to show the examiner I know that to work out the profit or loss at a given number of units, it's total revenue minus total costs. So it would be 0 minus 5,000, which is a loss of 5,000. Remember, I'm putting the brackets around it to make it obvious. In business studies, as soon as it's a negative number, not allowed to write the dash in front of it like you can in maths. It's a nice clear set of brackets. and 20,000 minus 15. And so this is a positive number, and so I can see clearly it's 5,000, the profit at that 1,000 units. So I'm going to move on to this. Make sure that you've got this somewhere nice and clear on your desk that you can refer to, and you'll need your piece of graph paper. Now, in the exam, you will always be given what the axes are. So just to clarify, I'm always going to write a title because I think that makes it obvious what I'm referring to. The horizontal axis is always the output. So I've used the generic word output. You could write soft toys if you wanted to. And I've chosen, because I know that it needs to go to the maximum output of 1,000, I've chosen nice and clear boxes just to go up in 50s. And I'm only going to write the 200, 400, 600, 800 and 1,000. If your writing's a bit neater and smaller than mine, you could put in 100 if you wanted to. Although this is likely to represent in the exam, because really they want to almost test, can you read a graph just as much as can you actually draw it. And then on the vertical axis, it's costs and revenue. You can add a pound sign in there if you wanted to, and it's highly likely so as not to put a lot of data in it. If it's thousands, you'll get the standard 000s. And in order to make sure that you always know that you've got the right number, if you refer back to your grid, you'll see that the sales revenue, the highest output is 20,000, and that's why the graph goes up to 20,000. In the exam, it's likely to go higher than that, because again, they want to test you, but I'm making it quite easy here. So once you've represented this on your piece of graph paper, we'll continue with drawing the break even. Okay, so the first line I'm going to draw is the fixed cost line. Now, it's always horizontal. If you're trying to draw a different shape, you're not drawing the right line. And you can't just draw the line and not give it a label. One without the other doesn't get any marks, so I need both elements in order to get the marks. Now you can see when I've drawn this, I'm a bit of a crisscrosser. So in relation to my my table, I go 0 along because that's the number of output, and the fixed costs are 5,000 there. And you can see I've drawn a small, you can see that I've drawn a small point there. And then if you refer back to the table, the output is 1,000, so I'm over here at 1,000. I'm climbing up the 5,000. I've drawn one more point. I've used my ruler to draw my horizontal line, and I've labelled it fixed costs. Now the important element here is that none of my lines go beyond my maximum output, because remember, we always refer to our costs within a given range, and you don't know that this factory for soft toys can make more than 1,000 products, so you must stop your line at the maximum output. If you continue, you've given away the mark. You won't get any marks because the examiner will recognise that you don't know this factory has a maximum of 1,000 soft toys, to produce a maximum of 1,000 soft toys. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so my second line I'm going to draw is total costs. You might ask yourself, well, why have I missed out variable costs? Variable costs, remember, are combined with fixed costs to give total costs. The only reason that I would draw that at A level is if the exam asked me to do it. So by doing the total costs, I've been able to step forward, and it's exactly the same principle for drawing the variable cost. So listen carefully to how I would do it. So if you think about it, I'm referring to my table again. It says at the output, total costs, at the output of 0, total costs are 5,000. So you can see there, I've got a nice crisscross under there. Oh, and surprisingly enough, it's not actually a surprise, total costs will always begin on the fixed cost line. That's a rule of thumb. You can write yourself a note for that if you like, but that's how I'm going to clarify it. 0, 5,000. Now, because I want to absolutely make sure that I'm going to get all of these points available to me in this activity, I'm never just going to assume I've drawn my fixed cost right, and so that's where I'm going to start it at. Always going to refer to my numerical workings in order to plot a fresh point. So my second point, at the maximum of 1,000, then it says £1,000 output. Total costs are going to be 15,000. So I go along to 1,000, go up here to 15,000. I've drawn my little cross. I'm going to use my ruler to give a nice straight line. And look, I haven't forgot the label of total costs. So in reality, it's the same procedures I'm practicing each time. If you always refer to the graph, you'll always have an output of 0, and you'll always have an output at the maximum, and you'll be able to draw your line between. So if you were a GCSE student, you might have been used to drawing all of the interval points. At A-level, we're not testing that. We just want a minimum and a maximum, because we're more likely to ask you about what you've discovered. Okay, so my last line on this then is my total revenue line, and so I'm just going to go through the same procedures. At 0 output, I'll get 0 sales revenue, and that is generally a rule of thumb, that you could always just go 0, 0, and you will know that is correct for total revenue. So I'm looking to my maximum line then at 1,000, and it says sales revenue at 1,000 is going to be 20,000. So I'm going to go up to 20,000, plot my point. It will definitely, if you were asked to do this in the exam, crisscross somewhere on the total cost line, and I'm giving it a label. If you haven't crisscrossed, you need to go back to your workings because you've done something wrong. I can't believe that an exam would be set that it wasn't a proper solution. So you'll always have 3 lines. Fixed cost is your horizontal, the total cost, which is on top of the fixed cost but at an angle, and then a much steeper line from 0 for total revenue. So effectively, I've got 3 points so far. Okay, so the last point that they'll probably ask you to do is that you need to record the break-even point. Now, you can do this in an assortment of ways, but basically if you do these 2 things, you'll find that you generally get the points. So you can see then where the total revenue and the total costs line crisscross, interact with each other. That is the break-even point. So I've always drawn in the past a dashed line all the way down at the bottom, and at A-level, break-even point is always in response to the number of units, and so it's always a vertical line, and we're looking here. So actually this is where they test you, can you read a graph? I suppose it could be possible for it to actually fall on a number, but it's perhaps a bit more reasonable to think that it might not, because that's testing you a little bit more. So you can see there, I think when I've drawn that, I think it'll come to about 500 units. Now, alternatively to that, you can see that I've drawn a nice round circle around where the lines crisscross each other, and I've given it a label of the break-even point. Now, in addition to this, you need to write what is the area of loss and what is the area of profit. So if you remember back to our table, I said you didn't have to draw the profit or loss, and I suppose the rule is always that they'll fall in this shape. But we can see there at 0 there's a loss of 5,000, and so this whole triangle here is an area of loss. So right up to 499 products we make a loss. We break even at 500, and anything above that, so at 501 products or more, we make an area of profit. And you might get given a whole graph and they might ask you to read from it, and so we'll do some activities in class when you bring this final graph to the class. Our very last thing that you might be asked to draw on a break-even graph is you might be asked to identify something called the margin of safety. So I think that the easiest place to draw it is at the bottom of your graph, only because I think it looks neater. And then if you have to go on and look at the area of profit or loss, you haven't confused your diagram anymore. So the margin of safety is asking you to find the numerical difference between the maximum units that can be produced in the factory. So in this case, the maximum number of units that can be produced in the soft toy factory is 1,000. So it's the difference between that and the break-even output. And in this case, my break-even output is 500 units. So my margin of safety then is the difference between 1,000 and 500. So there are 500 products in my margin of safety. And this means something could happen to the production of those 500 products, and I would still have produced enough in this factory to break even. So let's say, for instance, all factories are going to close down Christmas and New Year. Or you might find that your workers take strike action. And so for the period of time that they're out on strike action, there'll be no production. So it doesn't guarantee that you're going to meet demand from your customers. It just guarantees that you'll produce and hopefully sell sufficient goods in order to break even. So, finally then, I'm going to ask you to do this grid and graph by yourself. So don't panic, you can go back and look at the video again and determine how much is it, what are the stages involved. I can tell you, just as a matter of fact, that your horizontal axes will run 0 to 1,000, and so I will encourage you to do exactly the same as we have in the previous graph, and your vertical line has to go up to 35,000 pounds. And I believe, 26, 28, 30, 32, I was just checking the number of lines. I believe if you choose exactly the same, going up scale, going up in 2000s, you have sufficient room on that vertical axis, using the same scale, to go up to 35,000. Okay, make sure you bring this example to class too.